For over 76 years, NATO has been the backbone of Western military power, a shield of collective defense forged in the ashes of World War II. But what if, overnight, that shield shattered? What happens if the world's most powerful military alliance suddenly ceases? Would Russia roll westward? Would Europe rearm? Would China make its move? In this video, we dive deep into the geopolitical shockwave following a NATO collapse, exploring the military, political, and economic chaos that could reshape the world order. And remember, this is not science fiction. This is a look at what could happen tomorrow. A collapse of NATO would have significant repercussions for European security. Without the United States, Europe would need to provide for its own security, which would be a daunting task politically, financially, and militarily. Defense spending would need to increase dramatically, and European arms development and procurement procedures would require a radical overhaul. A consensus on a European nuclear deterrent, which is currently nowhere in sight, would also be needed. The disappearance of NATO would necessitate deeper European integration in the field where it is most difficult, at a time when many nations want less Europe, not more. The end of NATO would significantly increase Russia's power in European security. With the US no longer acting as a European power, Russia's opportunities to divide or intimidate its European neighbors would grow. Without NATO's protective umbrella, Europe would lack the confidence needed for coherent engagement with Russia, and some countries might seek their own deals with Moscow. Countries in the post-Soviet space that want to demonstrate independence from Russia through relations with NATO would face a strategic disaster, remaining permanently in Russia's sphere of influence. The absence of NATO would deprive Europeans and North Americans of a crucial framework for the use of military power. Without NATO, it would be difficult to generate the political and military stamina required for long-term stabilization missions, and ad hoc military operations would suffer from diminishing military interoperability. European military standards would likely regress, and the US's ability to enable military operations would become more difficult. The dissolution of NATO would encourage the regionalization of security. Without the alliance bridging different regional security interests, Southern European countries would focus on the Maghreb and the Middle East, while Eastern European countries would concentrate on Russia. Without the US as a security backbone, these groupings would lack the cohesion and strength to exert lasting influence. NATO's network of partnerships with countries worldwide would also disappear, forcing Europe and North America to rely on complex bilateral relationships. The end of NATO would pose significant challenges for allies like Canada and Turkey, which lack the opportunity to organize their ties to Europe through EU membership. Non-NATO countries like Finland and Sweden, whose military non-alignment relies on a continuing American role in European security, would see their strategic environment change significantly, reducing their latitude for regional cooperation. Without the prospect of NATO accession, the West would lose influence on reform processes in candidate countries from Southeast Europe to the Caucasus. While some might assume the US would be relieved of a financial and military burden, the reality is more complex. The US defense budget reflects its role as a global power, with NATO representing a relatively small portion of total US defense spending. Dissolving NATO would result in relatively small savings, but the US would lose allies, military bases, and political predictability. The geopolitical winners would be China, Russia, and those seeking to weaken the US's role in upholding the international order. A world without NATO would be detrimental to the US, its allies, and partners in Europe and beyond. Scenarios for US disengagement. Several scenarios could lead to the weakening or collapse of NATO. These include significant reduction in engagement. The US could reduce its engagement with NATO without formally leaving, shifting its focus to the Indo-Pacific, reducing troop levels in Europe, and scaling back participation in joint exercises. This would weaken the credibility of NATO's Article 5 and lead European allies to doubt US commitments. Functional withdrawal. The US could effectively disengage from NATO without invoking Article 13, closing military bases, withdrawing nuclear weapons, and ceasing participation in the integrated command structure. This would force Europe to fill the vacuum, but limited capabilities and divergent priorities would hinder efforts to replace US leadership. Formal withdrawal. In the most dramatic scenario, the US would formally withdraw from NATO by invoking Article 13, removing troops and nuclear assets from Europe. NATO would collapse in practical terms, with France emerging as Europe's leading strategic actor. Smaller regional alliances would emerge, and Europe would face years of strategic disorientation and heightened geopolitical risk. Consequences of a weaker NATO. If NATO's cohesion weakens, several consequences could arise. Diminished global influence. A fractured NATO would reduce America's ability to shape European security. Stronger Russian geopolitical position. Russia could exploit divisions within the West. Increased European defense expenditures. U.S. defense industries might lose European contracts as the EU prioritizes internal production. Trump's policies risk dismantling the post-World War II order, potentially reversing American foreign policy and creating instability.